Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Digital Leadership Series event. For those of you who are unfamiliar, my name is Vijay Gurbaksani, and with us, I should say, I'm the director of the Center for Digital Transformation. And our Digital Leadership Series is focused on discussing issues that, of course, pertain to digital technologies, but have macroeconomic and societal consequences. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Bhaskar Chakravorti to our forum. He is the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And he'll be discussing his paper, which is about to be published in the Harvard Business Review tomorrow. We missed it by a day. It would have been fantastic if it appeared today, but we will send you a link to that publication. The publication is called How Companies Can Navigate the Age of AI-Driven Inequality. And let me just say a few words. One, I've been in this field for a while, and we used to talk about the digital divide as really being income-based, where how do we address the inequality caused by people who had access to computers and people who didn't have access to computers? That was magnified during the pandemic when we saw significant differences in student outcomes based on the resources they had available to them. But AI has sort of extended this issue into so many different dimensions that I will let Bhaskar talk about. But really, the situation we're facing now is far more complex than the divides we faced in the past. So we're delighted to welcome Bhaskar to talk to us about this. But just very quickly, first, I'd like to thank our benefactors, KPMG and the Beal Family Foundation, who make these events possible, that we can offer them to you at no cost. And in terms of the format, I'm going to turn it over to Bhaskar in just a minute or less. He will talk for about 20 minutes. I will then engage in a Q&A with him for about 7 to 10 minutes. And then we will turn it over to the audience for questions. Please post your questions to the Q&A function on the webinar. The chat function is disabled. And with that, we welcome all of you to the session. And Bhaskar, take it away.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to a robust conversation. And I hope to just provide a few catalytic observations, shall we say, to get us going. And I welcome, obviously, questions from you and questions and observations from everybody who is attending. So with that, let me share my screen. So I wanted to spend a bit of time chatting with everyone about a notion that I call artificial insecurity. And specifically, so thinking about how we are continuing to advance in terms of spectacular developments in AI, somewhat less spectacular levels of adoption in AI, but equally spectacular increases in terms of social fragility because of our potential concerns about AI. Just to give you a little bit of background on what I do here at the Fletcher School at Tufts, among a few different things. One of the things I do is I run one of our largest research programs called Digital Planet. And quite often we think of ourselves as much like those medieval map makers who were at one point in time back many centuries, were trying to figure out essentially what was happening in this planet that we lived on, and where the land masses end, where the waters begin, where the mountains are, where the valleys are, and kind of essentially creating those initial maps using which we all, not we, but our ancestors, kind of navigated this world, and then continued to evolve and grow and refine those maps. And wherever the medieval map makers didn't quite figure out what was, where the land was, where the waters were, or had no clear ideas to what was going on, they would scribble in the margins, here there be dragons. And I think of ourselves as very much like those medieval map makers on the digital planet, on the AI planet, as we are still trying to figure out where the waters are, where the lands are, land ends, and where the mountains and valleys are. And there are lots and lots and lots of places where we are scribbling, here there be dragons. Now, my discussion today is going to be about what some of those dragons are in the context of this AI planet, and to put this AI planet in the larger context of the digital economy. Here is a mapping of the digital world as it stands pretty much today. This is a map of 125 countries, which pretty much account for over 90+% of all digital activity around the world. The vertical axis captures the state of digital evolution, how far a country has gone in its journey from a physical past to a digital future. And the horizontal axis is a mapping or a plotting of where that country is in terms of momentum, how quickly it's making that transition from physical to digital. And I've got 125 countries thrown on this chart, and it may be a little hard to read from where you are, but one way to organize this chart is by the 4 quadrants. So the top right quadrant are the countries that we often call the standout countries. These are the ones that are doing very well in terms of their state of digital evolution, but they're also moving very quickly. So both momentum and state, they're very, very strong. To the top left are the countries that are experiencing a degree of digital arthritis. They are a little bit somewhat more mature in terms of their level of evolution, but their momentum has slowed. The ones at the bottom left are, what I would call the watch-out countries. And these are the ones that are struggling both on the rate and the state. And the ones on the bottom right are quite often the most exciting countries in the world, because that's where you have a lot of headroom in terms of growth. They haven't fully evolved, but they are also experiencing an enormous amount of digital momentum. And the countries that I can see right, on the bottom right of the chart are countries such as Vietnam and Thailand and Armenia, Indonesia, India, Cote d'Ivoire, and so on. So it's quite a diverse mix of countries, mostly from the developing world. And now it's interesting to see, and we've been doing this for the last 12 years in terms of mapping the state and rate of digital evolution around the world. And this is the first time incidentally, that the United States actually comes out number 1 on our ranking of digital evolution across all 125 countries. And China comes out number 1 in the ranking of momentum. And so I think of this as quite an interesting dichotomy between the 2 most important digital players on this digital planet. And I often can also think of this as the great digital divide, particularly in the context of where we are going as we consider the future of digital being dominated by AI. And one of the significant changes that AI is bringing about, in addition to the advances, in terms of digital performance and translation into all kinds of tasks and activities and creativity, it's also leaving its footprint on the environment. And as we know, there are large amounts of, a number of conversations about the potential of, CO2 emissions because of the increasing need for energy to power data centers across the world. And this is kind of one of the big growth areas, both in terms of the data center industry and in terms of the energy industry. So alongside the digital evolution and momentum, I also thought I'd share with you another dragon, as it were, which is what are the environmental trade-offs that we are navigating as we continue to make this journey from a physical past to a digital future. And this measure that I've got on this page here is a very different index that we call the burn to earn index, which basically kind of says how much CO2 equivalent am I burning in any given country for every dollar I generate in my GDP from the digital industry. So that's the burn to earn. And the lower the amount of carbon for every dollar, the more efficient you are on this index. And you can see a whole bunch of countries that are doing quite well. Iceland, Norway, Switzerland at the very top. And then you have countries like India, Algeria, Mongolia, Bangladesh, Argentina at the bottom. And specifically, I thought I'd sort of call out a few countries. Iceland, obviously, doing extremely well. Countries like Singapore, which have been watching their environmental footprint, quite carefully. They rank number 28 on this chart. And an interesting country is that of Canada, whose prime minister has been visiting the United States recently. There's a lot of discussion in Canada about Canada becoming the next frontier for data center growth in North America. And there's a lot of discussion about greening the energy infrastructure in Canada in anticipation of that. The United States, of course, is middling. It's doing all right. It's not the best. It's not among the kind of the least performing countries on the burn to earn measure. And then when I look at other major countries like China and India, you can see where they rank. China ranks 84th and India ranks 120th out of 125 countries. So this is kind of the picture of the digital landscape as it stands right now. And then the question is, where do we go from here? What comes next? Well, we all know that what comes next is what's been the obsessive factor in the digital ecosystem for the last a few years, which is artificial intelligence, a technology that's been around for decades and decades. But suddenly, the last few years, it has just come to the front of our screens. Last year, we spent $230 billion on this industry. This year already, $500 billion have been committed to advance this industry. And in terms of what it is that we are creating, through this unprecedented levels of investment, we are creating God, says Mo Gaudat. We are summoning the demon, says Elon Musk. We are doing something more profound than fire, says Sundar Pichai. So the rest of us who are kind of not at the very heart of the invention of this technology are following along, with a bated breath in terms of where might these unprecedented levels of investments and some of the more really spectacular outcomes of it, where is it all taking us? So I know there are lots of questions that come up in the context of AI. I'm not going to focus on all those questions. Instead, I'm going to focus on three questions that have to do with this issue of the dragons associated with the AI planet. So the first question I want to ask is, can we trust AI? Of course, the whole idea of all these investments is that the other side, people are actually going to adopt these tools, and they're going to adopt these tools in a way that feeds some kind of a business model somewhere, because all these billions, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars being spent, somebody needs to get paid back. Otherwise, we are looking at a gigantic collapse of this whole system, at least from a business standpoint. So trust in AI is going to be critical to adoption of AI, and not just adoption, but paid adoption. It's one thing for me to actually deliver this presentation in the form of a limerick because I'm simply having fun with a large language model. But you want me to pay for this technology. The second thing, of course, is what are the largest societal implications of the greater adoption of AI, and does this actually contribute to all kinds of inequalities and asymmetries, and potentially, create a set of vulnerabilities that we might regret later if we don't take care of it now. And speaking of taking care of it now, what exactly can we do? How do we mitigate the risk? Now, when you think about trust in AI, multiple studies across the board are suggesting that users are intrigued by AI, but their level of trust in the technology is actually not improving, despite the fact that the performance of these models are getting better and better, but the level of trust is dropping across the board. And it's definitely dropping across the developed world, and the developing world, people have much lower exposure, and perhaps the drop is a little bit less. So the question is this trust gap going to go away as the technology gets better? To answer that question, we need to understand, why does AI have a trust problem? It turns out that there are many, many answers to that question. There are many reasons why people don't fully trust the technology. There are process risks. It's a black box technology. For a lot of people, there's lack of transparency, and because there's lack of transparency, they don't quite want to use it for highly critical, mission critical or sensitive applications. There's a highly concentrated industry that's delivering it, and there's some concerns about the amount of power that this industry might be accumulating. There are concerns about the data that goes into the training of the algorithms, and the data itself is essentially a reflection of our past, and our past is a bit of a messy past. And if that mess involves bias, it involves asymmetry, it involves holes in the information, it involves distorted information, all of that can get fed into the system and potentially amplified by the system. There are concerns about where and how that data is collected and who has access to it and how it's going to be used. So issues relating to data privacy is another contributor to this lack of trust. Then there are concerns about safety. Who has access to these technologies, and do these technologies trigger decisions that could potentially be, somewhat, dangerous to us all? And then we don't even quite know, what are the ethical guidelines and guardrails that determine the decisions on these technologies. After all, we know that AI is essentially a mathematics that's sitting on top of data, and neither the data informs an ethical framework, and mathematics certainly is just an objective phenomenon that sits on top of whatever you feed into it. Specifically, if you think about the safety issue itself, a survey done a couple of years back of the largest survey of experts in the industry suggested that people didn't feel particularly optimistic about the outcomes of AI, and at least in terms of likelihood, even the net optimists in the survey put the probability of human extinction at 5%. At 5%. Now, that is a little worrisome, because if somebody were to tell me as soon as I'm boarding a plane that the chance of that plane falling out of the sky is 5%, and the people who are telling me that are Boeing, the maker of the airplane, and the pilot, then I would not get on the plane. And I'm willing to bet most of us on this call may think twice before getting on the plane. That said, we are all on the plane. And that said, most of these doomers who were around, they wrote a letter in March of 2023 asking or calling for a pause in development. Most of those doomers have sort of gone silent. Wherever people used to talk about AI safety, a lot of those conferences, those summits have now rebranded themselves into AI action. If there were bills in Congress to try and put together some guardrails and regulatory systems around AI safety, most of those bills are stalled, and it's pretty clear that the current administration does not really have much appetite for coming together with safety regulations, because the emphasis now is on accelerating AI. And specifically, the concerns around safety have to do with antagonistic nations, where there may be an algorithmic finger on the button. And the most antagonistic of the nations right now is China. And the rhetoric against China has become even more strident than it ever was before. So this 5% was from a survey done a couple of years back. I wonder what that percentage would be if we were to take the same poll today. So with that, I can keep layering on the many more reasons why we worry about, it's kind of the fragility of the AI system itself. It doesn't perform all that well in many instances. It has errors and hallucinations. It has blind spots. It can deliver misinformation on top of some amazing information, on top of something just, we couldn't even imagine some of our best researchers to be able to pull together. So it's that, is essentially holding almost contradictory elements of performance in our heads. And then a final category of issues that are still, going to be hanging over us, even if we get better and better in terms of performance, and that has to do with the macro risks. What's the future of work and wages? What's the implication for international and national security? How is the technology and the data being used for surveillance, whether by the state or by the corporate sector? And what are the environmental impacts? These are big macro questions that we still haven't been able to wrap our arms around. And on top of all that, asking the question, what does AI mean in terms of the social compact that has, been part of democracies for forever? And might this technology lead to some potentially irreversible, potentially catastrophic divides that we may not be able to pull back on, if they get too wide. And when I think about, what this technology may or may not do in terms of social fragility, again, I turn to the people who are supposed to know about this technology much more than I do. And Sam Altman seems to be, pretty sanguine in terms of the future he's imagining. He says, not that complicated. We need the technology to create more wealth and policy to fairly distribute it. Everything necessary will be cheap. Everyone will have enough money and be able to afford it. Brilliant. If that was the world we're heading towards, this talk should just get over right now. The problem is, I don't fully know what he means by a policy to fairly distribute it. I'm not sure we are there yet in terms of a policy that fairly distributes this technology to create enough wealth. Fei-Fei Li at Stanford is also quite sanguine. She said, no matter where the breakthrough occurs, whether it's happening right where UC Irvine is, or in Beijing, or in Boston, where I am, or anywhere else in the world, it has the potential to make everyone's life much better. Great places to start with. However, when I think about the different kinds of inequalities that AI might lead to, I start worrying that there are far too many fault lines on which this technology might be standing. And I've identified 6 fault lines. One is a data fault line. As I said, the data itself, or that is used to train the algorithms, that contains a massive amount of unequal information. And that is going to then create an algorithm or a set of algorithms which then amplifies that divide as you look ahead. There's potentially an income divide. We don't know what the impact on jobs are likely to be. Is it going to augment jobs? Is it going to displace jobs? Whose jobs are going to be displaced? Which kind of tasks are going to see an increase in productivity, and which tasks are just going to be handed over to the machines? And we get all kinds of results from a bunch of different experiments that are going on right now. It's pretty clear that in the near term, it is likely to create an income divide. And I can go into more details on that, and we can have a conversation about it. There's a usage divide, simply because you can just walk across any room and start talking to people, and you realize there's some people who are much better at figuring out the flaws and potential powerful aspects of this technology, and people are going to be using it in very different ways. And that division in terms of usage gets exacerbated when you go outside the elite circles that many of us might be moving in. And we'll see a separation in terms of how some parts of society are going to be able to utilize AI far more efficiently than others. Then there's a global divide. The developed world has the underlying infrastructure to benefit from AI, and the developing world, or the countries that are at the very bottom of the economic pile, they have missing infrastructure, and they're not necessarily going to see the benefits the same way as the developed world. There's an industry divide, as in the sheer amount of concentration of resources that are needed, whether it is data or compute or high-end chips, or so many other forms of resources that calls for economies of scale. And currently, there are about 6 companies that pretty much dominate AI development here in the United States, and by translation anywhere in the world, because much of the AI industry is dependent on what is happening in the United States. And then there's an energy divide. Because it is so environmentally taxing and is putting such a strain on the energy grid, already we have about 1 billion people in the world who live in energy poverty. That problem is only going to get worse. And it's going to get worse even if you say we're going to build more renewable energy infrastructure, even if you say we're going to use algorithms to be more efficient in terms of our energy use. We can run through all kinds of simulations, and it's pretty clear that the strain on the grid is only going to get worse. The stress on water sources is only going to get worse. So as we sort of think about these issues, how do we mitigate the risks? So typically, the first place you go is that this is a big macro societal problem, lots of negative externalities, as economists like to call it, and there is likely to be a market failure. So we need to turn to governments. We need to turn to policymakers and regulators to be wise enough to look over the horizon and say, okay, we need to be mindful of these issues and build some guardrails in place. Now, in addition to regulations, I would submit that regulations are not going to be enough because this is a fast-moving industry. The regulatory system cannot keep up with the pace of this technology. So we need many more levers in play. We need technologies, we need markets, we need institutions. And these institutions could be third-party organizations, could be academic organizations, it could be civil society groups that step in and they become partners to both industry and government and even users in order to make us better stewards of this incredible force that we have on our hands. Now, as it turns out, from a regulatory standpoint, we are not going to see much action in the next few years because it's pretty clear that Washington is not going to be taking a whole bunch of action in sort of addressing these social fragilities. So we are left with three critical levers. And when I talk about the three critical levers, they're technologies that can potentially solve for problems that other technologies can create. And we've seen lots and lots of examples of that. There are institutions, companies, organizations, they don't work alone. And we can think about third-party systems that can act as partners with external practice. And finally, markets, which create the incentives for us to come up with the right answers, the right business models, the right pricing systems in order to potentially modulate some of the distorting behaviors. And just to give you a sense of uh, how these levers might work, I'm just going to pick a couple of examples from those different divides, and happy to go into each one of them in gory detail, which I'm sure we don't want to right now. But just to give you a sense of hope, of optimism, because I've sort of given you a laundry list of potential fragilities. Now I'm going to give you the good news that we can actually do something about this. So we just think about the data divide. And in each of those categories, technologies, institutions, markets, there are things that can be done. So, for instance, on the technology side, there is action that can be taken. There are tools that can be adopted to make our data sets, the training data sets, more representative of the demographic attributes of the populations that are being sampled and the populations that are being affected by the algorithms. There are fairness constraints that can be built into optimization algorithms. There are a whole bunch of systematic bias testing that could be done, such as disparate impact or equalized odds, and a whole bunch of other tools that have emerged over the years, and we can start adopting them in a far more standards and routinized way. You can partition data sets into smaller subsets and then run simulations to check the robustness of the models. And there are tools now that are coming out from a variety of different organizations that can help you test the bias in your data. And a lot of this requires a behavior change, a culture change in the R&D groups and the development teams. And much of that could be done through change in practices, including things such as bias impact statements that AI teams could adopt, and working with partner organizations. And from a market standpoint, markets can be very powerful regulators of the existence of bias. It turns out that, even though there is an enormous pressure on companies to push products out because we're in a race, and any kind of testing or checking for bias, will slow things down. But customers eventually and currently are demanding unbiased outcomes. And it turns out that of a survey that was recently done of over 350 companies, at least a third of those companies suffered losses because of the presence of AI biases. And many leading players have begun to brand themselves in terms of kind of saying, look, our AI is better because we have actively taken steps to debias our data sets. Now, taking a very different example, a very different kind of divide, the energy divide. Of course, we know that the technology is enormously environmentally intensive. That said, we are getting better at getting more efficient at being able to, reduce that impact on the environment. There are chips that are becoming more efficient. NVIDIA's recent chips can deliver 30 times the performance using, 25 times less energy. There are improvements and innovations in cooling center in cooling center technologies and the expenses associated with cooling. There are new hardware architectures that we can turn to, and then there are algorithms that can minimize energy-intensive operations that have begun to emerge, not just here in the United States, but many of the open source models, in particular DeepSeek, has signaled that innovations such as using a mixture of expert techniques can actually reduce the amount of compute and the number of steps you need to take in order to get to roughly the same level of performance. And there are a whole bunch of other hardware innovations. There are training programs that can be developed in order to reduce the energy intensity of both the training of AI programs and also the operations of AI models. From a market standpoint, there are, the fact that you're using less energy that translates into a more efficient cost structure, which then should translate into a more competitive company. And that force of competition, could potentially drive a lot of companies, both at the consumer-facing end of the AI value chain and everybody up the supply chain to become more energy efficient. So there are lots of positive directions to go. I do want to come back to that part that I had blanked out, which is regulations. Ultimately, these problems are too big. They're too systemic. There are too many elements involved. So we can't really live without regulations. And so here's a thought that I would like to leave you with, which is I don't expect a whole bunch of action to be taken in Washington, D.C. However, there are regulators in lots of other parts. At least I'm thinking about the United States right now. There are different kinds of actions happening globally. But within the United States, different states have regulatory systems that may have a bit of a different view in terms of how they approach it. So in order to kind of figure out how to inform these regulators and get them to sit up and pay attention, what we did was we created a heat map in terms of where are jobs likely to be most affected by AI in the coming years. And so here's a quick picture of some recent work we did to identify which parts of the country are likely to see the greatest effects of AI on jobs. And the redder you are, the more exposed your jobs are going to be. By exposure doesn't necessarily mean jobs are going to be lost. Exposure could be augmentation of jobs, but it's going to be, essentially a change. And if you're a regulator, you should pay attention. So you can see which parts of the country are likely to see some pretty significant changes in the coming years or happening right now. And as a state and local regulator, you will want to pay attention. So I think the answer in the next few years is going to be in local and state regulation as they start examining what kinds of jobs, what's the nature of the exposure? Does this mean displacement? Does this mean augmentation? How do I train people in different ways in order to kind of mitigate some of the fragility that might come up? Do I have to come up with compensation schemes and all kinds of other things? So there is a call to action in terms of state and local regulations that's informed by this map. So with that, I just want to thank you for your attention. I'd look forward to a conversation. I know I've thrown a lot at you on a topic that, of course, we've been getting a lot thrown, at us over, practically every single day. But I hope this was at least, a few ideas that, got us all thinking. And I also ask you to think about, what excites you the most about where we're headed on this AI planet and what worries you the most. I've only spent most of my time on the worries. I could spend another 45 minutes talking about all the exciting stuff, but we'll leave that for a different session. Thank you.
Well, Bhaskar, that was illuminating, and I don't know why I'm smiling. I should be frowning, I guess, at this point. So you put your finger on, I think, several things. Actually, you put your fingers on many things. So first, I think it's important to remind everybody that there's incredible promise, but you did highlight the risk. From all the risks that you highlighted, one of the things that jumped out, I want to focus on at least 2 or 3 things. One is, personally, I'm a little less worried about sort of the energy risk and things like that. Not that I don't worry about it, but all relative. Because at the end of the day, I think when we can come up with technological solutions like more efficient algorithms or locating data centers in energy-rich countries like the UAE or whatever, perhaps we can mitigate some of those concerns. Where I get the most concerned is, I would say, with AI in the future of work, what happens to jobs? And then sort of like where you said the problem is too big to be solved by companies alone, or it has to be regulators. And then you talked about sort of the role of government, and in particular, probably state and city governments until we can get some coordinated federal action. But let's focus on the future of, and the other thing that I don't know if we're going to have time to spend on today, but I was actually, the global divide is something I would like to spend a minute on. And perhaps let's just start there. So I participated in a panel for the Clinton Global Initiative about less than a month ago on education. And one of the things that jumped out was in continents like Africa, that they just don't have the infrastructure to even create the educational opportunities, nor the data that they will need to actually implement AI in their countries. And so I think we will see, where you started was the divergence among countries. How much of an issue is that, like this geographic distribution of where the benefits go?
Sure. Yeah, so just a great question, really important question. It's a question that we should be addressing right now, which is, the global impact of this. So if you just look at the macro picture, according to the IMF, about 60% of jobs in the developed world, 60 to 70% are likely to be affected by AI. And in the developing world, about 40%. And when you go to the even poorer countries, low-income countries across sub-Saharan Africa, it drops to about 25%. Okay, so that's the rough picture. That doesn't sound great because all the benefits of AI are going to be proportional to those percentages. Now let me flip this a little bit. Okay, think about the obsession sitting where you are, Vijay, in California, or the obsession sitting where I am in Boston, Massachusetts. We are all waiting, looking at our watches, and wondering, when is AGI going to be here? Somebody says it's going to happen anytime. Somebody says 5 years from now, 10 years from now. The obsession is about big AI, artificial general intelligence, which basically takes over all human capabilities. That's fantastic. That's great. It's really pushing the frontiers. But guess what? You go to enterprises, talk to company managers. I'm sure there's several of you right here on this call. There's a constant conversation about quote unquote use cases. What are the use cases that justify me paying for an expensive AI model? It turns out today, lots of people are using AI. Only a third of companies and enterprises are actually paying for it. So we don't yet see the ROI in the big AI world. Now let's talk about small AI, and that takes me to Africa. The biggest employer in Africa is agriculture. The biggest source of agriculture, the people who are involved in agriculture in Africa, are smallholder farmers. 50% of their crops get destroyed by pests. 50%. Okay. So it's a very low productivity sector, which is the highest employing sector in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we have already lots of applications. There's an application called Plantix. There are lots of other applications. Very simple. What they do is you take your feature phone, a simple camera, take a picture of your crop and upload it on the Plantix app. It will check it against a whole database of different affected crops. It'll tell you what the problem is. It'll give you a home remedy, and it'll give it to you in your local language. So that 50% loss of crops, I can bring it down to 40%, 30%, maybe 25%. Just imagine that one small application has a massive swing in terms of the incomes of people in that part of the world. So I would actually argue that it is much easier to get AI embedded in Africa than it is in California or in Massachusetts, because the use cases, by golly, they're there. These people, they need the stuff. And they don't need fancy AI. They don't need AGI. They need some elementary, basic AI. And off you go. Massive ROI.
No, that's really well put, because I remember there was this application in India where they used mobile phones so fishermen could figure out who to sell their fish to and choose which port they wanted to land in before they actually committed to selling the fish. So there's a lot of simple examples. That I often talk about that, actually, which is everybody seems to have forgotten about narrow AI or specialist AI or predictive, whatever word you want to call it by. But I think there's so much value to this. So that's useful. Let's talk, I'm just going to jump to the questions because there's a lot, and many of them are the questions that I wanted to ask anyway. So I think we'll go there. If you compare the impact, this is Norman Tyrrell, if you compare the impact that AI is having on society to other changes, steam power to industrialization, how would you assess the impact? For example, is this just another technology transition, or is there something about AI that's unique?
Yeah, every technology is unique, right? I mean, there's no we can
Is this more momentous than?
yeah, and it's also kind of hard to say which is more momentous than the other, because these are all, AI is a general purpose technology. It's like electricity. It goes into so many things, and then it has second and third order and 10th order effects, right? So it's like the printing press, it's like electricity, it's like the steam engine, it's all that kind of stuff. So then, I think that comparison is very apt. Then the question has to be, is this technology, this multi-purpose technology, is it going to translate into a wholesale transformation in labor productivity? Because labor productivity translates into increased income, and that translates into wealth. It also translates into perhaps a narrowing of income gaps. Not always, but one hopes that all boats get lifted. Now, the history with the previous set of transformational technologies, which was called the Internet and the World Wide Web, isn't that promising, because when we look at the data on labor productivity associated with the launch of various milestones of the post-internet age, say post-1990s, it was all going in the wrong direction. When basically the digital technologies started arriving, we saw the growth in labor productivity actually drop, and it just kept on dropping all at the wrong times, which got everybody completely confused. And Bob Solow, the very witty Nobel laureate at MIT, kind of said, "I see productivity everywhere except in the labor statistics or the productivity statistics." In fact, the productivity really went up during the pandemic. That was the highest spike in productivity. It'll be hard to be able to nail this down in a way that pleases all economists. So we will personally be able to say, yeah, I became a lot more productive because I didn't have to hire a bunch of research assistants to give me an answer. I just use my, whatever my favorite large language model is to get a bunch of answers to questions I had. So I think this is obviously going to be transformational. The question is, as we go through the transformation, there's going to be a mix of the positives and the negatives. And are we being farsighted enough to anticipate the negatives and then not try to rush back and plug the gaps? What we are currently doing in the context of social media, for instance, which is crazy. We saw many of these things happening when social media, started spreading, and then only afterwards there's this whole performative dance that the senators on Capitol Hill and Mark Zuckerberg and everybody else has to play, where you kind of lead him up, and then you wag your finger at him and say, "Don't do that again." And he said, "We won't." What's this nonsense? I mean, we're going to do this again for AI, so let's get ahead of it. We are in the middle of this thing, so that's the whole point.
No, that's very well put. I actually happened to watch a documentary when I was in New York a couple of weeks ago on some of the harms of social media. And I think it was a kid who was a teenager, broken up with his first girlfriend, and he logs on to an LLM or whatever. I don't know what system he actually, let me take that back. I don't know what he logged on to ask for advice. And the next thing you know, he was recommended suicide, and he suicides. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
and that's,
we know lots of cases like that, and I think it was Mark, but I may not be exactly sure. But they said that most of these kids, the next coming generation of kids, their friends are going to be agents, not going to be real kids. They're going to be AI agents who are going to be their closest associates. So now I start worry about my grandkid at this point. I don't have one, but I worry about their best friends being an agent.
So then I'm switching gears. I'm just trying to combine some of these questions in the interests of time. There's a lot of questions so my own take on this is very similar to yours, because AI at the end of the day is a general purpose technology, as you pointed out, similar to the internet. We do have benefits from hindsight from the past. Whether we have the collective will to do something about is going to be a bigger issue, but the impacts, because it's for targeting knowledge work, are so much more profound. I mean, we've seen there's plenty of heat maps of what happened to manufacturing workers in the past, and I think we were slightly oblivious to the consequences of these technologies, and now we're hopefully a little more aware. But there's a lot of questions about the impact of jobs. And so let me sort of ask you, one is our local governments, from Kalpana Ramakrishnan, who's one of our advisory board members, governance council members, our local governments taking note of AI's impact. Can you tell us a little more about how the heat map for jobs was created, what data elements, and then basically questions about that. So
Sure. So as you know, there are the fierce debates going on about what the impact of AI on jobs might be, and mostly academics. There are other bunch of think tanks and industry researchers who are running a bunch of experiments, to try to figure out, okay, I take a software team, or a customer service team. I give them access to a chatbot, and then I have a control sample, and then you kind of see what emerges. And I've talked to lots of organizations in terms of how are they incorporating AI in terms of their own work, and in universities, we are making some adaptations ourselves. So you can see some natural patterns that are coming out, and I don't want to kind of waste anybody's time as to what they are, but basically you can say that, okay, a certain set of jobs are going to be exposed. Okay, there are other jobs that are not going to be exposed, such as the people who are right now lopping off branches out of a tree just outside my office window. That job is not going to be exposed to at least most of AI. I'll expect humans to be involved there, but there are other jobs that are going to be exposed. So then you keep going through that decision tree. The next fork is going to be that job could be completely displaced, partially displaced, potentially changed or augmented. And so, those are not the only options, right? So then you can break that down into what kinds of tasks, at what occupational levels, at what hierarchical levels, in which industries. You can go through a systematic process of doing that. And then you can start breaking this down into, okay, I can make some hypotheses in terms of what percentage of those jobs are likely to be affected. And that percentage is going to vary depending on the industry, depending on the region, depending on the infrastructure, depending on the complementary systems that plug into that particular task. So it can all be done. Then, these are all hypotheses. Then the question is, what is the data? What's the data saying? And we just have some emerging experiments. There are people writing PhD thesis on these days, where you can say, well, it's the AI is likely to help the white collar worker who's at the top of the food chain. The best performer is going to become an even better performer because they're smart. They're going to figure out how to use the tool for their purpose, and they'll be doing higher order stuff. A different set of experiments say, well, actually, no, it's going to help the weakest performers because it's going to narrow the capability gap. So we have a whole mix of things. So I think right now we're in this phase of essentially figuring this out in the very early stages of the transformation. And you can make a variety of assumptions in terms of how this might play out. So that's why what I showed you in that map and the question around how the heat map was created, happy to talk you through a very, very detailed model that we developed in terms of just identifying exposure. It's easier to figure out the exposure part of it. It's much harder to take the next step in terms of kind of saying, what does that exposure mean? Does that
yeah,
mean augmentation? Does that mean displacement? And we're
no, that's really interesting because I actually just heard a seminar by David Otter, the other superstar economist from MIT, who talked about this at Stanford, and I was watching it remotely. And he talked about you also have to look at whether AI automates the skilled part of the job or the unskilled part of the job. So, for example, a London taxi driver who was expected to memorize the city maps of London, GPS has made, and driving is not a scarce skill, so that sort of de-skills the job. And then
yeah.
there's plenty of other examples where you take away the mundane work. So a highly paid expert, for example, can just focus on the expert parts of the job. So there's all of these interesting things that even when you decompose the job, you have to think about how sort of where the AI will be applied.
And one more thing, Vijay, I'd like to say that what we are trying to do right now, because it's such early stages, is we're trying to break this down in a linear fashion, which is
yeah,
a natural thing to do. But we know just from historical transformations, change happens in extremely nonlinear ways
right.
because the mathematics is not additive. So you could end up with a whole bunch of systemic factors that kick in, and then you have an exponential acceleration or an exponential deceleration, and you end up with completely unexpected outcomes, which is exactly what I would expect.
No, and especially when you start thinking about AGI, then who knows what. But one of the things that jumps out at me very powerfully about all of this is Demis Hassabis got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and he's a neuroscientist and a computer scientist. And when was the last time you heard about somebody who's not trained in chemistry getting a Nobel Prize in chemistry? And for that matter, Geoffrey Hinton got the Nobel Prize in physics, right? So it really speaks to how powerful these technologies are getting. And of course, you have to work with domain experts to do that. On the question of experience, we know that the results are all over the map. We actually, my research team and I, we actually have a project right now where we are showing in software development that it's the less experienced software developers who are getting bigger gains from using some of these LLM-like solutions compared to the more experienced professionals. But that's not a universal result, and I think the environment and context matters greatly. Let me see what else. Here's a question from Meghna Sinha, who actually works very closely with the center. She's a senior industry fellow at the center. As you astutely mentioned, regulations are going to take a backseat in the current administration. I believe there is no reason to not work towards moving towards model governance, which is model performance bias testing beyond open source, to drive towards immutability, transparency, and decentralization. So how do we sort of get to regulation at the level of the model?
So, this is I think a really interesting question because when you say regulation, we expect an outside party, that doesn't have a vested interest in the or a commercial interest in the particular technology or the underlying the model that is powering the technology, and they have the wisdom to understand the potential risks, and they also have the wisdom to kind of look ahead and see what are some ways in which I can put guardrails without necessarily putting a roadblock on the highway. Right, so that's why the metaphor of guardrails keeps coming up. Unfortunately, we're not going to see that. I mean, there were 600 bills in Congress, before Trump took over, right? During the Biden administration, 600 bills that were still waiting, for people on Capitol Hill to hear them. So, and part of the problem is that most of the people who are going to be debating this, they find this stuff confusing, and so they rely on industry to come in and educate them. Now, right now, the way the environment has shaped up is that so much money has been pumped into the push towards AI, and then DeepSeek has just completely overturned the model at the beginning of the year, and people are wondering, gee, is this a bubble? Is this not a bubble? Can we? So everyone is in this acceleration mode. So this governance systems, which you could say, well, maybe companies could get into a self-governing mode, but nobody's self-governing because it's very hard to self-govern when you're on this treadmill. How do you do that? And physically, I don't think that's possible. It's not possible for you're putting aside the hardware makers like Nvidia and so on, because they're benefiting from the enormous demand for their chips. But if you think about the Googles and the Microsofts of the world, or the innovator class, the Anthropics, the Open AIs, and so on, for them, they have to just move as quickly as possible. So I don't think governance is necessarily a high priority at this point.
What you're saying reminds me of something I read a while ago. It was a book about past industrial revolutions. And one of the things they say is, don't bet on the company, bet on the technology. And, we see this as a winner take all, because at the end of the day, I mean, if we think about search engines, for example, there was a dozen or so players that nobody even remembers. And now we're down to 2 or 3. And so, my view of the world is clearly AI is here to stay. Clearly, it's going to be a dominant technology. We're not completely sure whether it's going to lead to positive or negative outcomes, probably a mixture of both. But it's clear that these people are playing for the long term. When Microsoft invests God knows how many billion in restarting a nuclear power plant, it tells you, they're committing to buy electricity through 2050. Right. So it tells you that they're playing a very, very long game. Would you agree with that? That there's sort of a lot of investment, winner take all. These companies desperately want to win that horse race, and some of them will sort of fall by the way. And that sort of, I think, getting back to what you were saying a minute ago, is what reduces the likelihood that they will want to govern themselves.
Yeah, so there's no question there's a lot of investment. I mean, though that data is out there, right?
Yeah,
So we know that there's a lot of investment.
that's true. Yeah.
And interestingly, the investment levels are just going up. I mean, you would think that after the DeepSeek announcement, that everybody take a deep breath and kind of say, okay, let's see, let's reverse engineer what those guys have done, and maybe there's a cheaper way to do this stuff. No, the U.S. industry went exactly in the opposite direction. They doubled down. So a lot of investment. Now, companies like Microsoft can play the long game because they're Microsoft and they have done extremely well up to now. For Google, it's in many ways is existential because for Google, the core of Google is threatened by the emergence of particularly of generative AI being the alternative to the search engine. So Google just has to be in this game, not just for the long term, for the near term. So each of these companies has a reason to be in this business. If you think about Amazon or Nvidia, I've got a cloud business that's benefiting. I've got a chip business that's benefiting. Everyone's got a reason to be in it for the long haul. And then there's an interesting player like Meta, which is kind of saying, well, we are none of the above, but we've got this. We need the data, and we can create a completely new paradigm through this a version of open source. It's not open source, it's open weight, so whatever one chooses to call it. And then that can start generating an AI ecosystem outside my regular competitors in Silicon Valley. So you could see this really fascinating competitive space opening up. So I really think that that's where we are headed, which is the open source, a proprietary model, sort of competing with each other. The proprietary model, by the way, being funded by unprecedented levels of investment, which we've never seen before. In the case of the internet, the investment was done by the government. So people could actually have business models that were priced at zero. Now
Right.
you have AI models. I need to be able to monetize this stuff. Otherwise, at some point, the investors are going to say, hey, I can't give you any more money. So I do believe there's a very different, uh, you know, commercial mechanics that are going to be at work. In terms of the winner take all, I think it's an interesting thing to explore, which is if you are in the internet related space, version 1.0, 2.0, social media, all the children of the original internet, a core principle behind them was network effects. When
Yep.
I think about AI, network effects don't quite work the same way. I
Oh, they
don't
do.
necessarily have a better model just because, everybody else is using the same model. So it's not like being on Instagram because everybody else is on Instagram. So the social aspect of AI is actually very different from the social aspect of the children of the internet. So I think that's something for us to think about. Now, the winner take all aspect would be true if I really believe that the absolute latest version of the NVIDIA chip is a must-have for me to get the best performance. It's unclear whether I need the latest version of the chips because, frugal innovation seems to be doing a pretty good job in
Right.
terms of getting us, good enough technologies. So this is where we start wondering, how the
And
AI industry might actually be structurally different
And
from
this is,
social
yeah.
media.
And this is one of the really interesting things about digital goods, which is they're very easy to protect under lock and key, like the way you would do with physical goods. I'm going to take one last question. It's from Tom Andriola, combining two questions. Tom Andriola, who's the Chief Digital Officer at UCI, and Michael Immerman, who's just had a book come out on the economics of fintech, is a colleague of mine, sits next to me. They're both asking sort of similar questions, like how do you define digital maturity and digital momentum? And then what data is available to quantify where these countries are data rich, data poor? Like, what is the underlying data for these, where you started?
Yeah, so I can give you a link to
Okay.
our sites, which actually have all the data. We have the data on the data across 125 countries, and for each of those 125 countries, when you think about digital evolution or digital maturity, we created an index that is drawing from about 170 odd performance indicators, and those performance indicators look at the demand side of the digital ecosystem, the supply side of the digital ecosystem, the innovative aspects, and the regulatory and policy sides. We smashed that all together into an index. And And then, of course, the whole idea is not to take a massive amount of complexity and reduce it to one number. The idea is to generate that one number so I can do an apples to apples comparison and then unpack everything to figure out, okay, why is the United States over here? Why is, Colombia over there? And why is Brazil in that third place? And then, provide some prescriptive, ideas for both investors, policymakers, technologists, if you want to change your position in those places. And in terms of the data pools, we have actually, there's something called the new GDP that we created. It's called Gross Data Product. And the whole idea is data being the fuel of the digital industry. Which country has the largest pools of them?
Interesting.
And we've got a bunch of that information. I'm happy. I'll send along the link. Maybe we can share it when we share the link of the HBR article.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you one last question, but my apologies. This unfortunately always seems to happen. There's so much interest in these themes that an hour just doesn't seem to be quite enough. So my apologies to those who asked questions that didn't get answered. I'm going to go to one last question from Ann Cameron, and I'm going to tweak her question a little bit. Is what is one ambitious AI initiative you envision your institution leading in the next 3 to 5 years? So if you, as you study sort of these new digital divides, what's the next thing you want to address? Like, how do we increase the probability that we're going to get to a more productive outcome and sort of reduce social inequality, however we choose to define it?
Yeah, so great question. There are a number of different things that we are doing and we want to continue to do. So I just gave a talk to the high-level Council on Jobs at the World Bank, where I made a pitch for basically the World Bank collaborating with about 600 tech hubs across the continent of Africa and small businesses to essentially create opportunities for small AI applications in agriculture, healthcare, education, finance, and some governance systems. And the tech hubs are a great place to actually disseminate, digital literacy and training and so on and so forth. The World Bank can be the scaling platform, and the small businesses essentially are the ones that use this stuff because it's mostly an informal sector. So using a combination of these elements, we hope that what you can do is you can improve the productivity of agriculture, for instance, reducing the impact of pests, and the improving the productivity of agriculture generates incomes. It releases labor, putting that labor into manufacturing and services, which then translates into an engine for growth, which is what we saw in the Asian tigers. So trying to replicate that process, basically using AI as a driver. So that's kind of number one of what we are hoping to do. Number two, and I know I've run out of time, is to essentially do this breakdown that I mentioned in terms of what jobs are exposed, and then where are the jobs in the spectrum of displacement to augmentation, and then what does that translate into in terms of local action and local regulations as we see the regulatory landscape going from federal to local in the coming years.
Yes.
And there are a third thing, which is agentic AI, which just seems to be on a lot of people's minds, which applications are likely to be most affected, and continue to work on that direction.
No, that's great because one of the things that I think Paul Romer said very early on was there's enough knowledge in the developed world that we can share with the less developed world at sort of no cost, and AI makes access to this existing knowledge much easier to get, and sort of there's a lot of problems that can be solved pretty easily without worrying about, like you said, the big models of AI. I think we could continue this for at least another hour, maybe longer. This thing is hugely important and hugely exciting. So. Hey, thank you so much for taking the time. We know you have a lot to do, but I think this has been just extraordinarily illuminating to the audience. Thank you so much for joining us. You're getting a lot of applause. It really was fascinating to hear how you lay out through the landscape. And let's all of us keep our fingers crossed for good outcomes, because the promise of AI is so massive. We really need to find a way to get to this promised land, if you will. And the one thing I'll remind our audience, because this is something I say a lot, is AI doesn't determine our future. Humans do. Humans using it, and so we really need to be alert or aware of our collective responsibility as citizens of the U.S., citizens of the world, however you want to define it, but really sort of focus our attention on making sure we get to a better place, to a better world. With that, thank you, Bhaskar. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to KPMG and the Be a Family Foundation. Thank you to my team who puts these events together. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and thank you for joining us.